What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time excited to bring you a little bit of a preview for the release version of Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader, courtesy, of course, from Owlcat Games. This video is going live right as they are ending a live stream for the co-op mode of the game that was just recently added in, or at least confirmed, I should say. And while I won't be covering co-op much in this video specifically, you can check out the stream they just had if you want to see it in action for yourself. But if you are unaware, the release version of the game will actually have multiplayer. There's a variety of different servers to choose from. It looks like it's using a lobby system of sorts. And if you want more details than that, you'll have to check out their stream. Now, from there, let's talk about the release version of this game. For starters, the only real difference between what they gave me access to and what will be released on December 7th, when the game officially releases, is polish that they'll be working on right up to the deadline, of course. But I also don't have access to the last 2 acts of the game. So while this is the release version, it currently ends where the beta ends at the end of Act 3. Though here in a few weeks, I'll have access to those as well, which is when I can start working on a proper review. But thanks to this early access, I can, of course, work on guides and things like that will be useful over the course of the month before the game even releases. From there, however, let's actually dive into it, talk about all the changes that I've seen here, as they include a great deal of improvements and refinements from the beta. Starting right from the beginning, however, when we click into a new game, we will be met with difficulty options. Now, previously, they were balancing around normal and core, with a few different modifiers allowing you to adjust things individually, which you can still see here, but we have the addition of hard and unfair on top of a story mode. So if you want to play this on an easier difficulty, that's available to you, and the classic hard and unfair are back as well. It looks like most of what the difficulty will be changing specifically is dodge modifiers, cover bonuses, and defense and damage reductions, alongside how easy it is for characters to get injured, and just the general stats of both skill checks and the enemies themselves. Now, separate from the difficulty settings specifically, we also have a variety of dialogue settings that you can change, and these are mostly just quality of life stuff, but you can toggle them on or off. Once we've got that all sorted out, we move on to the freshly refined character creation screen, and while this is a subject I will also make a separate video for, the important things to know are that you can pick a preset character if you don't know how to build a character just yet. They do have a few presets available for you, and then the first part of a custom character is creating your character's appearance, which includes all the things you would expect, such as tattoos and augmentations appropriate to the Rogue Trader setting. From there, we pick our home world. Each of these provides a unique bonus to both your characteristics as well as your potential talents and features. Some of them provide more direct things, such as the Forge world allowing you to pick an upgrade to your character of sorts, and then most of them, however, simply give you the option of extra features or talents when your character levels up. But the world your character is from will determine a variety of bonuses, so don't discount it. And the talents that these open up for your character, that is to say feats that you'll pick as you level up, are unique to that world, meaning that the ones you can get from the world you pick can be a significant influence on your build if you play into it. Now, the next choice after this is your origin. This is effectively what your character was before they became the Rogue Trader. Most of this was present in the beta, with a few notable things. For starters, the origin outfits, that is to say your physical appearance, was greatly overhauled. The Sanctioned Psyker actually has a pretty decent outfit as opposed to like a skin suit. But the origin also comes with, again, modifiers to your characteristics, determines what you're good at, as well as certain other abilities. A very important choice that can form the backbone of your build in many ways. Now, the biggest changes here for the release version are the Sanctioned Psyker changes, as the Psyker is now, of course, fully implemented. This includes a variety of choices around the type of Psyker you would like to be, each coming with their own talents and abilities available on level ups, though it is worth mentioning that this is a starting point for the Psyker and not the end point. You can, after the fact, when you're leveling up, branch into the other portions of the Psyker abilities if you wanted to. Again, we'll talk more about this in the character creation video, but after we pick our origin, we then pick a Triumph and our Darkest Hour. These are origin specific, meaning that you'll have 3 options for both your Triumph and your Darkest Hour, but those options are determined by the origin you picked. So for the Psyker here, we have specific Triumphs and Darkest Hours related to being a Psyker. I don't know the full effect of these choices just yet, but presumably they will come into play in the story in some way as they form your character's background. So my only question here is just how extensive these choices will wind up being to the plot, which is not a question I've answered just yet. After this, however, we pick our formal class, which is our archetypes. And as promised, so to speak, previously, we do have some new additions here, meaning that the classes or archetypes available to us in the beta weren't the only ones. Though we can see from this UI, at level 1, we still pick from the 4 basic ones. Then at level 16, you'll be able to pick one of 3 options for an advanced archetype. And then lastly, at level 36, you'll be able to become an exemplar. Now, your base archetype and your advanced archetype are the most important choices, as you might imagine. Your base archetype being warrior, officer, operative, or marksman, basically determining whether you want to be melee, ranged, support via leadership and helping out your allies, or debuffing enemies and exposing their weaknesses. By highlighting these, you can see which advanced archetype they're going to have access to. The advanced archetypes are basically just refinements and extra abilities and gameplay features to the base archetype. Now, for those who didn't play the beta, your base archetype is effectively just through Act 1. By the time you get out of Act 1, you'll already be pretty much leveled up to pick your advanced archetype. And I'll get into the nitty-gritty details of which one does what later. But before I leave this section, I do want to talk about the exemplar portion of this. It looks like the exemplar is simply giving you the opportunity to pick up extra feats and talents from your previous archetypes, which is going to let you further customize your character. It looks like this is meant to be your sort of end game where your build is pretty much in place and you're just refining your stats and maybe picking up extra talents and the like. So think of it as being an exemplar of the archetypes you already have. And then from there, you assign characteristics like you did previously, with you being able to assign an extra 5 points to each one 2 times. So basically, you'll have some points to assign to your character for what they are good at, and you can see those little notches to tell you exactly what, alongside their secondary stats that each characteristic associates itself with. And then, very interestingly, we get to pick our starting ship, confirming, of course, what we kind of already knew, in that we would be able to swap out and change our void ships. So as you can see, even just from character creation, there's a lot of changes that have happened with the release version. But we are not done yet. So I'm going to briefly touch on some story stuff, the basic plot setup, and then 1 or 2 extra notes. If you don't want to hear that, definitely skip past this part. I don't want to spoil anything for anybody this early, so I want to be extra cautious here, but it was already well known that the plot of Rogue Trader is going to revolve around our trade empire and our interactions with a chaos cult that we meet right in the Act 1 area. That was part of the beta, that was known information. However, the only thing I want to add to that for the sake of this video and this preview is that from the beta, they, I would say, added and changed a few things, both for the sake of presentation and some stuff that gives you new information. So even if you've played the beta, on release you can expect a surprise or two in how the story is presented and explained. There will be some fresh scenes and everything, which I thought was cool, and I did just want to give that brief mention for. Now, much of the rest of the game works and functions exactly like it did previously, simply with a lot of refinements to it. For starters, as you play through the game and you're experimenting with your build and the like, or maybe you don't like the companions, you might want to respec or hire mercenaries, and you can do that now with the release version. Once you take control of the Von Valencius flagship, you'll have access to an NPC that can both serve as the respec vendor and the person to hire mercenaries for you. This works pretty much as you would expect, as it's how it worked in their previous games. You just walk up, talk to the guy, and he can either hire a mercenary, which effectively sees you creating a mercenary, or you just respec your characters. So if you don't like any of the companions, there are other options, and I was glad to see that confirmed in the gameplay. Though another big thing I wanted to touch on is that combat has been, I wouldn't say overhauled, but definitely changed. Many enemies actually have more abilities now, specifically bosses in particular, and they're a little harder hitting, even just on normal, and they tend to respond better to what you're doing to make them a bit more deadly. I've played a lot of the alpha and beta of this game, and I will say that it was pretty immediately obvious when I ran into boss enemies that they were more competent than they were previously. They were genuinely a bit of a threat now, even on normal, and it wasn't quite so easy to just steamroll over them with very basic approaches. And while there's still definitely bosses you can defeat, you do have to pay a little bit more attention to what you're doing or you risk getting injured, which brings me to the rest system. It does look like how they're approaching your characters being injured and needing healing outside of combat in much the same way they have up to this point. Basically, as your characters get injured in combat, they will pick up wounds. You pick up enough wounds, this leads to a trauma. Traumas are big debuffs to your character. However, they will be healed once you return to your flagship. After combat, your wounds, or your health, is automatically restored, with the only thing being carried over is your traumas. So over time, if your characters keep going down and getting hurt, they'll pick up more and more of these traumas, making it harder to win. And what's more, if you are in combat and one of your characters gets defeated, that is to say brought to zero, they will automatically revive after combat if you win with a trauma, but you cannot revive them in combat, meaning that protecting them and making sure they're healed up is going to be a big part of combat, which means performing well and making sure you're not getting your characters just regularly torn to pieces is important. You don't have to worry about things like a complicated rest system in the Pathfinder series, which is just another way that this game, in addition to its basic combat systems, which again I'll also cover in a new video now, but I've also done previously, is frankly just a bit more simple than their previous work. So this game should be much more approachable in that regard, and thanks to all the difficulty options and the tweaks they've made to some of the combat already, it looks like there will still be a good degree of challenge there if you want it, but it shouldn't be nearly as hard to get into as Pathfinder. The combat itself still functions basically the same way. Everyone has movement point and action points that they'll get to use. A lot of attacks will clear your ability to move or act afterwards, with the exception of certain abilities and things that specifically allow you to do that, as taking as many turns as possible and swaying the action economy in your favor is a big part of this turn-based tactical affair, which coincides with all the new specific loot you can find. A lot of this was in the beta as well, but I wanted to call it out here. A lot of the itemization has improved. You're going to find a lot of items that buff your characteristics or give you certain effects in combat that make the itemization lean into what you're doing with your archetypes, which again just gives you that little bit of depth to combat that I think a lot of people will enjoy, at least if you're on this channel probably. So that's nice to see as well. Moving on from there though, as you've probably seen throughout this video, they've also updated and refined the UI in many places where it was clearly placeholder before. Now we see that more artistic approach where things look a little more pretty, so to speak. In some places the UI was cleaned up and made a little more legible. You understand what's going on a little better. So definitely glad to see that for the release version coming up. So to move towards wrapping this video up, while there is a lot more that I could go over and a lot of things that they've clearly changed and addressed, I will be going over that more specifically in various videos on topics where I can deep dive those things like character creation. I'll probably go over combat again, taking a look at spaceship combat where they've made a lot of refinements to the UI, made it more clear how the shields and things like that worked. So there's even more than what I'm showing you here is my point. However, all of that doesn't mean anything if the game doesn't run well. So let's talk about bugs and technical state before we move on with this. I do want to mention again, I did not mess with co-op. I do not know how that runs. Co-op is a bit of a different beast than playing single player. Check out their stream if you want more information on seeing that in action. However, in terms of the bugs I experienced with this build, it's also important to remember that they are actively working on polishing this for the next month, but realistically this build is pretty close to what we're likely to see at launch. So with that in mind, I did run into mostly minor stuff. For instance, I had a few tutorials triggering at odd times when they weren't really relevant. Beyond that, the worst thing I encountered was I got one character stuck on the terrain in combat and they could no longer move, and I'd say that was about the most serious thing I ran into. Everything else was small visual bugs. And because this game is made in Unity, I did run into an issue I've often found in those games, both from Owlcat and any other Unity game I've played, where if you're playing for multiple hours at a time, sometimes the game will just randomly start chugging on you, going incredibly slowly, and you have to essentially restart the game to fix it. And it comes with pretty serious hits to your performance otherwise. Again, not really unique to this game, but it is still happening, so do be aware of that. So personally, all I encountered was pretty minor stuff, and while that was great for me here and now, it is obvious that me testing this isn't really the same as potentially hundreds of thousands of people testing it on launch day. So other people might run into other things, but my experience so far has been pretty good. The last thing I want to say on this, though, is that what I'm genuinely curious about in terms of performance and how things are running is the last couple acts of the game. That is to say, the stuff that has not been beta tested. Because traditionally, especially with CRPGs in particular, the later parts of the game that were typically hidden, so to speak, from public testing often are in a worse technical state than the rest of the game. I've seen that with basically every CRPG that has released. It's very common to games in general, but it is especially bad for these really complicated games in terms of their narrative structure and continuity. So while I've been okay here in the first parts of the game, it's hard to say how things like your save file is going to hold up. Is it going to turn into incredibly long loading times? Are there going to be problems with quests and things breaking once you get towards the end game? And those are questions I simply don't have answers to right now, and that I will likely have to wait for a review to actually comment on when I have access to those things. So in terms of bugs and performance, tentatively, it seems like it's doing pretty well. Less problems than I had with Wrath of the Righteous at launch at the very least. Though we'll have to see if that continues to be the case afterwards. But as for today, right now, I think that makes for a pretty good release preview. Though do keep in mind, as we move towards release, now that I have access to this version of the game, I will be releasing some videos on specific systems where I deep dive them a little more. But I hope this general look gave you the information you were after. And if you have any specific questions, do feel free to drop them down in the comment section below, which naturally means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, as I would love to share more about Rogue Trader with you. Regardless of all that though, truly just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.